Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rechakwadash. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations be unto the Akim, out here pushing this gospel in truth and in sincerity, to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord willing, fall upon your houses. This is Brother Quanah Watt, come back at you, Lord will, with the edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Lord will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. Amen. We are definitely in the time of the fulfillment of Revelations chapter 13, verse 16 on down, which is the mandatory implementation of the RFID microchip, which is the MO to the TB, And sometimes, we code word, some of these words, man, so that way, we don't get our videos taken down. But, if you've been around and you've been, watching, paying attention, right, you ultimately know what we're talking about. These are heavy times, man, right? Esau, Edom, the self-proclaimed so-called white man, right? He is moving extremely fast, right? When it comes to establishing, the legislation, right? The policies, the bills, the acts, when dealing with, this digital currency, this digital system that he's ultimately setting up, it's moving extremely fast. Matter of fact, let's grab this precept before we get into this article. And I also have, something I asked on ChatGPT, but this is Revelations 12 and verse 12. It says, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. And that devil was ultimately speaking about a man, right? Matter of fact, let's prove that in the blue letter, right? That it is ultimately speaking about a man, right? Revelations 12 and 12. Let's go into that word devil, right? Strong's G 1228, right? Diablos, right? It says prone to slander, slanderous, accusing falsely, which is Esau, Edom. This is what he does, right? To the Israelites, right? Which we're seeing right now, right? That war that Esau is making, against the Israelites, with his ICE. And again, these different policies, him taking away, the power of the so-called blacks to be able to vote and so on and so forth, right? Trying to go back, to the Jim Crow era. That's what Esau Edom, but, that's currently what he's doing. But the point being in, the second bulletin, it says metaphor applied to a man, right, who, by opposing the cause of the Most High, may be said to act the part of the devil or to side with him. Again, this is speaking about a man, right, which we know today, right, is Esau Edom, the self-proclaimed so-called white man. He is the devil that the Bible speaks of. And again, we're seeing him move extremely fast, right? Again, all the legislation, the policies, right? They're all being passed, right? Like I had seen this earlier, this actually, I want to say a few days ago, right? I clicked on it. It says U.S. regulators propose bank-style identification rules for stablecoin users. Now, stablecoin is ultimately what? That central bank digital currency, if you will, right? It says the U.S. federal financial regulators have jointly proposed a rule requiring payment stablecoin issuers to establish bank-style customer identification programs, or SIPs, to prevent illicit finance, right? They ultimately want to be able to, identify the user, right? Like a regular bank does, right? You have to give them your social security. You gotta, they gotta take a picture of you. They gotta be, you gotta give them your ID card. They gotta have all your information, right? In order for you to be able to have or utilize right, that currency, right? It says issued on June 18th, 2026. The joint proposal introduces strict identity verification standards aimed at aligning the digital asset space with traditional banking regulations. The draft rule stems directly from the implementation of the Genius Act, right, passed in July 2025, a year prior, which legally mandates that permitted payment stablecoin issuers be treated as financial institutions under the Bank Secretary Act, or the BSA. So again, right, they're moving to establish this digital currency as a really a global currency, because you have Visa, as well as other like Bridge, which is a payment platform, if you will, right? By Visa, right? They're ultimately issuing and creating, right, their platforms to be able to issue and trade and what is that, purchase, and so on and so forth, right? I think it was in over 107 countries right now, so it's moving fast, right? You have the Stable Act, right, which ultimately introduces that stable coin. Then you got the Genius Act, right, which ultimately allows for you to be able to regulate, right, or basically push that stable coin, into and again, like we're reading, right, regulate that stable coin. And then you got the Clarity Act, which they ultimately just recently passed, which allows for these different issuers, right, to how do I break that down, man? I mean, you can ultimately go and look up the Genius Act, the Clarity Act, and the Stable Act, but all three of those acts really ultimately allow for the regulation, right, the issuing, and the establishing of that digital currency called the stablecoin, and there was, recently you had that UFC 250 that happened, at the White House, right? And there was ultimately rumors, right, that stablecoin, right, was ultimately paid, or that the fighters, right, were ultimately paid in stablecoin, so they're already starting to use these stable coins, right? The infrastructure is already set up, right? It's ultimately another digital currency, and moving forward, right? It's not just individual payments. You have whole states starting to adopt it now, right? You're on finance.yahoo or Yahoo Finance, right? It says, as Bitcoin is tanking, Wyoming becomes the first state to issue cryptocurrency. What to know about the FRNT stablecoin, right? It says, after blasting to an all-time high in October 2025, Bitcoin has been stuck in reverse, shedding nearly 50% of its value as investors pull back from risky bets, despite boasting a massive 1.23 trillion dollar market cap. Bitcoin is now clinging to the key $60,000 mark, a level many traders see as a make or break for the battered cryptocurrency, right? Cryptocurrency, the Bitcoin is ultimately not, it doesn't have the same value. And that's, again, is because, the competition, right, the stable coin, right, is now coming into play, It says, but despite that, one U.S. state has launched its own cryptocurrency. According to Bloomberg, Wyoming has officially become the first state in America to issue a government-backed stablecoin, right? A digital token called Frontier Stable Token, right? Or FRNT. Could Wyoming's stablecoin be a chance to modernize payments, attract financial innovation, and even generate revenue for public schools? Or is it a solution looking for a problem in a state where many residents still prefer cash, checks, or traditional banking? And really, this is just a trial, if you will, right? They start to release it, right? Esau works in gradualism, right? So he'll start to pass the legislation, the policies, the bills, the acts, and then what he'll do is he'll start issuing it out. He'll start issuing it out on very small levels, right, in increments, and the people will start to kind of, gravitate towards it, right? Because I can guarantee you 99.999% of the people don't even know, that stablecoin, has ultimately, is now being adopted, right, on a global scale, right? And it's ultimately going to be pushed. It's going to be made, the one world, currency, if you will, right? And we've done lessons on it. We've done, videos after videos after videos. This is what Esau wants, right? Because ultimately, and we're going to get into it, right? The stable coin can be regulated. It can be controlled, by the government, right? It says, and the biggest question, will anyone actually use it? Right? It says Wyoming, big crypto bet. Wyoming, a state where there are fewer than 600,000 residents, and cows outnumber people roughly 2 to 1, might not be the first place people would expect to find a financial technology revolution, right? So they're doing it, right? Again, when everybody's looking left, right, or when everybody's looking right, Esau's working on the left side, when nobody's really paying attention, nobody's really gonna, expecting, Wyoming, right, really a farm state, right, to ultimately be, the first state to utilize, a cryptocurrency, right, and to really go, digital, nobody's gonna expect that, man. So this is why Esau does it, right? He wants to ultimately, he's already gotten his, his data, right? He's already done his trial runs, right? He's got all his policies and bills already established, his acts established, his laws. So now he's ultimately putting into play, right? And he's going to ultimately doing it on such a small scale. He wants to see how the people react, because you got states that have multi-million, like Texas, I think is like 7 or 8 million, or no, it's got to be more than that, right? Like 10, 12 million people, if not more. Like the state of Arizona's got 7 million people, in the state of Arizona. So you got a lot of people. Like California is easily, like, we're talking about 350 million people in total in the United States. And you do it in a state where there's less than 600,000 people, Come on, man. Right? We see right through Esau, and we see right through your plans, man. Right? It says, better known for oil rigs, cattle ranches, and Yellowstone tourists than cutting edge tech startups, Wyoming has emerged as one of America's most unlikely hubs for cryptocurrency. For nearly a decade, Wyoming lawmakers have been building one of the most crypto-friendly legal environments in the country. State legislators have passed roughly 50 laws aimed at attracting digital asset companies, creating specialized banking structures, and clarifying how cryptocurrencies are treated under state law, right? So for over 10 years, they've been ultimately aiming, for this, man, showing you again, this is all part of his agenda, right? This is something that's ultimately been, this isn't something that's new, right? This is, again, Esau works in gradualism. He's like, okay, this is the plan. This is what we want. How do we get there, right? Baby steps. How do we get there, right? And throughout the years, right, we've been seeing him ultimately do just that, It says, the efforts haven't gone unnoticed. Cryptocurrency exchange Kraken moved its headquarters to Cheyenne, Wyoming, from San Francisco last year, citing Wyoming's supportive regulatory environment. Right? It says now the state has taken things a step further by issuing its own stablecoin. Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon shared the following statement with MoneyWise. With the Frontier stable token, Wyoming is choosing stability over initial volume. We are not looking to build a massive high-risk commercial empire. Instead, we are methodically engineering a secure U.S. Treasury-backed digital asset designed to safely bridge the gap between traditional finance and modern digital innovation, all while helping to directly support our public schools. So they're passing it off as something that is ultimately going to benefit, the school system or the masses. But in reality, it's all about control. It's all about, him being able to, make it to where, because again, right, going back to Klaus Schwab, right, from the World Economic Forum, he stated that China is the prime example for all the countries to follow after. And we've seen it time and time again where people are being locked out, and you can look it up. You know, people are being locked out of their bank accounts, locked out of their, their wallets and whatnot because of their social credit score, right? If walk on the crosswalk 1 second longer, or you know um buy too much meat, right? Your carbon footprint is over the limit. Hey, well, guess what? Now they're ultimately going to penalize you, and they're gonna do it via locking you out of, your wallet, if you will, your bank account, right? And this isn't something that is, oh no, they can't do that. Stablecoin is regulated. It's but in reality, the stablecoin can be treated as such, man. You can be, have your assets frozen, you know. Matter of fact, that brings me to what I was looking up. I asked on ChatGPT, is stablecoin a federally regulated currency, and can someone be locked out of using their stablecoin at any point in time? Right? It says a stablecoin is not the same thing as US dollar in your bank account, and they're ultimately trying to replace it. They're trying to replace the physical currency, the US dollar, with stablecoin, with a digital coin. It might not be called, right, federally, it might not be called, stable coin, right? But it might be, nonetheless, it's going to be a digital currency, right, that is going to be issued, right, that the government is going to have control over, right? It says, but many stable coins are becoming subject to increasing federal regulation in the United States, right? Examples include USD coin, Tether, PayPal, USD, right? It says these are digital tokens that are generally designed to maintain a value of about $1, right? One digital dollar equals one physical dollar, right? It says, can the government or issuer lock you out? Yes, in many cases. Meaning they can lock you out. You cannot use that currency, right? It says it depends on the stablecoin and how you hold it. The issuer can often freeze tokens. Most major stablecoins are centrally issued, central bank digital currency. The company behind them usually has the technical ability to freeze specific wallet addresses, block transfers, comply with court orders, comply with sanctions or law enforcement requests, right? For example, both USDC and USDT issuers have frozen wallets in the past when responding to alleged fraud, hacks, sanctions, or legal orders. And see, they're slowly, again, as ESOL continues to pass policies, laws, so on and so forth, ESOL is slowly establishing different laws, policies, and bills that ultimately make it to where, hey, you're going to have basically a version of China, right, and how they move here in America, really all across the world, right? It says exchanges can lock your account even if your stable coins themselves aren't frozen. An exchange such as Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini can suspend your account, require identity verification, freeze withdrawals during investigations, restrict access due to regulations. Self-custody reduces some risk. If you hold stablecoins in your own private wallet, you are not dependent on an exchange for access. However, the issuer may still be able to freeze the token themselves. Blockchain networks can sometimes censor or block activity under certain circumstances. Future regulations could impose additional restrictions. That right there is Revelations 13 verses 16 on down, speaking loud and clear, right? And we know that they are ultimately federally regulated, right? But it tells you right here, asset, right? Cash in your pocket. Can an issuer freeze it? No, right? This can be seized physically with legal process, right? Bank account dollars, right? Issuer freeze it. Bank can freeze account, right? Yes, it can. Can the government affect access? Yes, right? USDC, USDT, yes. Self-custody Bitcoin, no central user, much harder to freeze directly, right? It says self-custody stable coins. Often, yes, the issuer can freeze it, yes, right? It says usually through issuer action, the government can freeze it, So this right here again, right? Let me read this last one. We'll grab Revelations, right? It says, so if someone tells you that stable coins are digital dollars that nobody can control, that's generally incorrect. Most major stablecoins have centralized issuers that can freeze or blacklist wallets under certain conditions. The degree of control varies by the specific stablecoin and how it is held. Right? Let's grab this. This is heavy, man. Call law Yahweh Shem Shah. Revelations 13 and verse 16. It says, and he causeth all, right, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. Right. So you again, and that's going. Let's grab into. That's going into the RFID microchip, man. You know, Strong's G5480, right? Charagma, right? It says a stamp or imprinted mark. It says right here, a theme carved sculpture or graven work, right? And then when you go into the root word, it goes back to what? Karax, which goes what? To a palisade, a stake, right? Which is the instrument used, right, to insert, right, the actual, device, right? That's the instrument, the needle, right? The hollow needle, right? That when they push it into your skin, they grab that and then pinch that between your index finger and your thumb. They grab that piece of meat and then they shove that thing in there and then, kind of like, push it in there, right? Like a syringe kind of thing. And then now you have that device under your skin. That's what that palisade is, man. And see, all that device is going to have all your information, man. Again, the second root word, right, being what? Grapho. It says to write with reference to the form of letters, right? To write with reference to the content of the writing. It says right here, it says to write to one, i.e. by writing in a written epistle to give information, right? Direction. So all your information is going to be attached to this device. We saw, JFK and his push for, data sharing between these different medical platforms, right? These different apps that you see on the phones and these different, the technology like your Oura Ring or your the Meta glasses or, these different smart watches that ultimately track your health. That he wants, like United Healthcare and so on, all these different, even your physicians to be able to have access to that information just by pressing, signing a waiver and saying, yeah, your doctor can have access to all that information, live information, and eventually, again, all of that information, right? They're talking about signing something on a tablet, this, that, and the third, and then he has access, all that information is automatically going to be uploaded, to that device, right? Your body temperature, your step counts, all this, because again, it's going to have all that information and have that ability. These different smart watches, smart glasses, smart rings, and so on and so forth. They all have those RFID chips in them, man. And the same thing, this little device, the Brain C Hip that China ultimately made commercial, right? It's called the Neo, man. Ultimately beating, Elon Musk's Neuralink, to the punch, man, making it commercialized, So they're already making it commercial. They're already issuing, the actual digital currency itself, right? Again, we are in these times, man. We for sure are in these times, man. And your ultimate, again, right? It's going to come a point in time, right? As we read, right? When you read, go back to Revelations 13, you go back to that word causeth, Strong's G50, 4160 poieo. It says what? To make, right? To acquire, to provide. It says to make a thing out of, to make, right? To make one do something, right? Cause one to, right? To make one do something, to cause one to. So he's going to ultimately make you, right? Force you, by, as he, continues to, make the dollar obsolete, right? You got more and more nations, which is all part of the plan. All these nations were in cahoots, right? 2 Corinthians 2:11, right? We're not ignorant of Satan's devices. We understand that starting with the elites, right? They are ultimately giving the shots, and the rest of these nations are following suit. You know, they're ultimately making it to where these nations are leaving the U.S. dollar and these different currencies. You got BRICS nations, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and as well as many other countries now that have joined BRICS. They're all coming together to create, a digital currency. As well as you got these different platforms, right? Bridge, Visa, MasterCard, so on and so forth, right? That are ultimately, opening up their ability to be able to trade, in these digital currencies and operate in these digital spaces, if you will. This is where it's coming down to, man, where everyone is going to ultimately be forced to have, this charagma, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be able to participate. You're not going to be able to buy or sell, as it says right here, right? Verse 17, Revelations 13, verse 17, it says, "And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the M-A-R-K, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." So in order for you to be able to continue to participate in society, you're going to have that charagma, and even then, right? If you have it and you're ultimately, against the system, or you're not doing what Esau wants you to do, right? Hey, well, he can still lock you out, right? And make it to where you're screwed. What does it say? Jumping up to verse, Verse 15, it says he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, and that the image of the beast should speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed, man. Right? Which we, seen, when you go into that word killed, it goes back to the word, Greek word apokteno, right? Let's grab it, right? Apokteno. But it says what? To kill in any way whatsoever, to destroy, to allow to perish, right? So it's going to come a time where Esau is going to say, hey, you don't want to be a part of this system. Hey, you're going to have to die, And that's when you, again, right, that's going to be what? That persecution. Because those who truly believe in Yahweh Shem Shai are not going to take it, man. So he's either going to lock us out of the system, completely, or he's going to actually come and get us, man, and put us in these FEMA camps. But see, that's ultimately the price that we're willing to pay, because we trust in Yahweh Shem Shai rather than man. We would rather obey Yahweh Shem Shai rather than men. Esau's going to come and say that you have to take it in order to be able to pay your rent, in order for you to be able to, put your kids in school, in order for you to get your food stamps, in order for you to, have a job, in order for you to, get paid. You have to have the RFID microchip in order to receive the stablecoin, because that's what's going to come on. That's how they're going to pay you. And we're not with that shit, man. We understand what comes with that, right? First and foremost, if you take it, right, you're ultimately solidifying this devil to be your ruler, perpetually, right? That's ultimately what it symbolizes, man, right? It's, as the elder apostle Tahar, right, ultimately coined it, right? The digital all, right? When you go back into the scriptures in Deuteronomy, I think it's the 15th chapter, it talks about, the law of having a slave, right? If that slave ultimately is pleased to dwell with you, right, to be your slave, and then what would you do? You would ultimately take an awl and thrust it through his ear like an earring, right? And that would be symbolic of him, that would ultimately solidify, that slave being your slave, perpetually, man. Well, this is a digital version of that, right? If you take it, you ultimately are saying that you want this devil to rule over you perpetually. And we don't. We want Yahweh Shem Shai to rule. We want a righteous rulership to be established in the earth. So we're not going to take it. And we're consistently pushing out, the videos saying, do not take it, man. For you Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, we're telling y'all, do not take this charagma. It don't matter, right? The circumstance that he'll ultimately puts you in. Right? Because at the end of the day, Esau has an agenda, right? Going back to the Georgia Guidestones, which his fucking ass tried to ultimately get rid of, right? He destroyed them, right? But it's still out there. The information is still out there. He wants the world population of 500 million, right? So that means about 7.5 billion people he has to kill. And who do you think he's going to come after first? You Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. So you would be a fool to ultimately accept this devil's agenda. What does it say? The trust in the shadow of Egypt should be your shame and confusion. You're gonna think he has your best interest at heart, but in reality, he wants to kill you. What does it say? War was in his heart. You can't trust these devils, man. And then on top of that, right? First and foremost, the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shah will destroy you. Right? Let's go to that in Revelations 14 and verse 9. It says, doom for worshipers of the beast. It says, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast in his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of the Most High, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. So we're talking about a straight judgment, man. No chaser. Right? Y'all ever had the harshest freaking alcohol? You take that and it just like Everclear. Like you just take it and it just freaking burns and it's hard to get through. Your eyes are watering, and no chaser. So you just have to deal with that. That's ultimately what the Lord is going to do to those, that ultimately take the Quran. You're going to get judgment with no mercy. No chaser. It's not going to, man, it's going to be bad, right? The Lord is ultimately going to destroy you via ICBM nuclear missiles and the laser beams that come from the chariots when Yahweh Shai comes. There's not going to be any mercy, man. If the Lord doesn't ultimately give you over to, Esau, Edom, or the different judgment that the Lord has prepared. It says, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. So there you go, right? There's going to be great judgment, right, for those that ultimately receive, the mark, man. That's ultimately what it is, man. Man, we are definitely in these times, man. Call law Yahweh Shemel Shah. Everything is moving fast, right? Esau's now issuing out, the stablecoin, man. Right? You got the actual device itself, right, being made mainstream, right, being advertised, if you will, right, even here in America, and now you got the actual digital currency now going out, being issued out. You have a lot of people, man, especially within the nation of Israel, right, more specifically, Bishop Nathaniel from the IUIC. For so long, right, they denied the fact that that the RFID microchip was, the MO to the TB, but now you're even starting to hear that, right, talking about, it was, the MOTB is white woman, or it's sin, or it's, it's Christianity, or it's this, that, and the third. Hey, all that shit is starting to die down. You're starting to hear that less and less, right? Let's go to Ezekiel 12 and 23 being the point. It says, tell them therefore, thus saith the Lord Yahweh by Shemel Shah, I will make this proverb to cease, man. Right? The Lord is having it to where you're not hearing, the MO to the TB is white woman, or it's sin, or it's Christianity, or it's sanctions and embargoes, or you don't hear that shit no more, man. Now you have IUIC starting to really start to inch their way towards, because they're talking about this digital system, right? And eventually, right, Elder Apostle Remlob, he ultimately called it that they would ultimately start doing that, that Bishop Nathaniel and the leadership of IUIC would start inching their way, to talking about, the MO to the TB and the digital system. And here you go. There they are. They're doing it. They haven't come right out and said that the MO to the TB, that the RFID microchip is the MO to the TB, but they're starting to talk about the digital system now. Showing you that great millstone, right? Starting with the elder apostles on down. We've been speaking about this whole time. Showing you that the Lord Yahweh Shemel Shai is really drawing that line in the sand, and he's doing it by having these prophecies speak loud and clear. Great millstone, right? Starting with the elder apostles on down. We've had the truth this whole time. This whole time. And now it's being made manifest, right? It says, verse 23, it says, tell them therefore, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua, I will make this proverb to cease, and they shall no more use it as a proverb in Israel, but say unto them, these days are at hand in the effect of every vision. And we're at the time where these prophecies are coming to pass, man. The last two major prophecies. The next one being the mandatory implementation of the RFID microchip, you know. And then what? World War III, right? Jacob's trouble, right? Hour of temptation, you know, where everyone's faith is going to be tested, even the elect, right? When that chip is made mandatory. And then what? World War III, right? Verse 24 says, for there shall be no more vain vision, nor flattering divination within the house of Israel. For I am Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua, I will speak. And how does the Lord speak? Through his prophets, right? And the word that I shall speak shall come to pass. It shall be no more prolonged. For in your days, O rebellious house, will I say the word and will perform it, saith the Lord Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua. And it's happening, man. You know, we're here. You know, there's really nothing that you can say against, you know, what this is the truth. You know, it's clear and it's evident. You know, do not take the charagma no matter what. Right, you Israelites, you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, do not take the charagma, the RFID microchip, no matter what. Trust and believe in Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua, the Heavenly Father Yahweh and his only beloved begotten Son Yahushua, you know. But that's all I got, man. Lord will is edifying. Lord will straight to the point. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua Ba'ashem Rachak Kodash. Double honor to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of the great millstone. Till next time I say shalom.